I'm live! Yay! I wanted to. I was thinking. I was reading up on what's it called? Kitchener versus Dover. It's the modern version of the Scopes monkey trial. 2005, I think it was, something like that. Anyway, I have realized that what I am really, really, really annoyed by, or so I should lay all the cards on the table. I'm an atheist. Don't believe in God. Haven't done 15 years. But I have long spent loads of time, loads of effort arguing about this, arguing theology, thinking about this in complicated ways. But I've started to realize that actually what I don't like isn't people believing in God. It's people insisting that they know things that they don't know. And so I'm going to go ahead and make us some points let's go through this. And the first thing I want to stress here is that, and the reason I want to stress it is because we've gotten this wave of conservatism advocating that we return to our Christian roots, advocating that we are values. This one is far away. Probably couldn't hear me. Now we can hear me. Can hear me, right? Is that doing anything? Is that supposed to measure anything? I don't know. Okay. Sound is probably better. And let's go back to the beginning. Because the foundation of Western culture is doubt. It all goes back to the ancient Greeks, to this culture that we have been venerating for thousands of years. And it all goes back to Socrates. It all goes back to this genius phrasing of the principle of doubt. All that I know is that I know nothing. And it is from this principle that we derive all of Western philosophy. It is from this principle that Western culture comes from. Western culture does not come from the belief in God. It does not come from the Vatican. It does not come from Christianity. It comes from the Greeks, pre-Christianity. And most importantly, it comes from doubt. And it is this foundational principle of doubt that has been rejected mainly by creationists, and it has been rejected in such an absurd way, just not weird, just absurd, by insisting that they have the answers. And that's the problem with that's the problem with creationism. It's not that it's religious. That's not the problem. The problem is that it's unscientific. It's unreasonable. It's arguing that they have certain knowledge about God, and obviously it's not surprising. It's been a kind of the bane of religion, that people who are rational and have rational beliefs will use religion to disguise their beliefs. They will use religion to provide themselves a shield of criticism, so that they can say, well, I know this is true because of God. They don't have to come with reasons. They don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to justify themselves. They just say, I know this is true because God told me to. I am overwhelmingly convinced about or that I know the mind of God. And this horrendous, atrocious arrogance is the problem. Problem isn't whether or not there's a God. Problem, that's just a philosophical exercise. Fun, maybe, but that's not the problem. Plenty of religious people are completely sane and reasonable people, willing to change their minds, willing to think about things, willing to reflect on how their relationship with God. Instead, we have these creationists who sit down and say, I know that God created everything as is, in situ, I think it's called, as is, and there is nothing, and I'm going to argue for this. I'm going to find the evidence for this conclusion because I know it is true. And this is the really vital thing here, is that I think you should be capable of distinguishing between studying his word and studying his creation. This should be trivial, but many people don't think it is, and many people are well, many people don't think it is. I'm certain that most of the people who claim to be, or who are creationists, understand this, understand that they shouldn't, that they're being arrogant in their way of describing, or they don't realize that they're being arrogant, but they have all the means to understand that they are just picking and choosing which parts of religion they think are true. They eat bacon cheeseburgers, even though the Old Testament is very clear on that. They wear polyester clothes, even though the Old Testament is very clear on that. There are so many religious rules. There are so many things in the specifically in the Old Testament, but some in the New, which, if taken literally, are complete nonsense and completely are things we wouldn't dream of implementing. But for some reason, as soon as it conforms even slightly with your preconceived notions, your reason goes completely out of the window. All of a sudden, you are incapable of interpreting it metaphorically, and that's insane. That's just insane. It's completely unreasonable, completely without reason, completely without cause. It is not how we do rationality. And this is, yeah, and I realize this is what's frustrating me. But what I want to give here is a little ray of hope, because we don't have to be this cynical. We don't have to be this depressed. We don't have to say, well, creationists are just the idiots of the world, the arrogant idiots of the world, using faith as a shield for criticism. There may Let's give them an alternative. Maybe, just maybe, what we need isn't what the problem is isn't that they lack critical thinking skills, but that they haven't had the imagination just yet. So let's use our imaginations. Let's delve into the metaphorical. I will confess that this is not an interpretation of the Bible that I have come to all on my own. I believe I read it in Yuval Noah. I don't know how to pronounce Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote the book *Sapiens*. And so let's go through Genesis. Let's go through the fall of man. Because in the fall of man, after God has created everything and placed everything in the Garden of Eden, where all life lives, where there is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and we are tempted to eat that tree. Right next to it is the tree of life, by the way, which, in my mind, imagining God speaking to a bunch of illiterate Bronze Age, pre-Bronze Age, Stone Age nomads, like shepherds, who literally couldn't count to more than 100 without probably at all, whose conception of a really large number was 1,000. When we think of just try to put yourself into the mind of God. Like, you've tried to explain things to children, right? Try to explain 1,000,000,000 to a child. Try to get them to really understand how big that number is. And then you'll get kind of an impression of what it must have been like for God to try and explain things to people who are so far back in the past that most of their experiences of reality are so radically different and so such scaled down so enormously from what we're doing right now. They didn't live in mega cities. They didn't have millions of people around them. They didn't know that millions of people could even exist. So, thinking of this, imagining that God is telling him, you have these little clues, like the tree of life. I wonder if maybe the tree of life is a concept that comes up later. Maybe that's a concept that might have been tried to be hinted at and was just completely misunderstood by Bronze Age nomads. But enough of that. What we are left with, is that humans were tempted to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. Blah, blah, blah. If I can speak, I'll say it again. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's a really important name. Because it's not just the tree of knowledge. We didn't just gain knowledge. We gained knowledge of good and evil. We gained awareness. Awareness of ethics. And more importantly, as demonstrated because right after we gain this knowledge of ethics, we get ashamed. We cover ourselves up. We're naked. Who told us we were naked? What made us aware of being naked? Who made us aware of what we looked like to someone else? What gave us self-awareness? Well, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the knowledge of ethics made us self-aware. And what is necessary? From a naturalistic point of view, from our understanding of evolution, what is necessary? What is special about humans? What is it that we have that other animals don't have? This one. It's huge. It's enormous. I mean, not mine specifically, probably smaller than average. No, mine specifically, but all heads, brains are so much bigger for us than they are for other animals compared to their body size. We have massive brains compared to our body sizes. And this is what's necessary. This is where all of the stuff happens. This is where all the thinking happens. This is where all of the self-awareness happens. And so, from this naturalistic point of view, this conforms exactly with what we're reading here, or what we're analyzing here. We're analyzing when we became self-aware, we had bigger brains. And what was the punishment for our self-awareness? Pain in childbirth and backbreaking labor. Also, the snake went off scot-free, which, as old school children know, sounds completely crazy, but makes complete sense in this, because the snake didn't change. The snake didn't gain awareness. The snake didn't know good and evil. The snake was just a snake. It was still just a snake. Nothing changed. It kept on being a snake. It kept on being a snake because nothing had changed for it. But we changed. And because we changed, we were punished. And it was not so much a punishment as a consequence. In order to understand good and evil, we needed bigger brains. The consequence of having bigger brains is that we needed to stand upright, because if we walk around like this all day, like the monkeys with like forward gaits, I mean, I know my posture is awful, but and the reason why my posture being awful it matters is because it's the massive head is just yanking on my neck all the time, and this gives backbreaking labor. As soon as I bend over for longer periods of time, my back starts hurting walking upright. But I needed it because then the compression of my massive skull goes straight down instead of like this. And similarly, standing upright, you know what that means? Walking around, you can't go bandy-legged around. You have to narrow your hips. Suddenly you have to, our body plans changed. And instead of having hips that could expand more and to fit our bigger heads, they couldn't. They had limitations. And so, for human women, they experience more pain in childbirth than, as far as we can tell, any other animal. And so, knowing this, being aware of this, and understanding that humans are so much, and so this attribute, this change, led to our punishment, or more specifically, we've read this story as a metaphor for our change, as an explanation of what happened, as a description of how humans changed, how humans went from being a part of the Garden of Eden, coming from it like all other life, living in it unaware and without care in the world, living in it as a part of it in the same way as the other animals, in a part of God's creation, in the same way as other animals. And then we diverged from that. And we became our own thing and did our own thing and left this wild embrace of this wildness that God had created. Instead of being just encaptured by nature, we started making our own world. We left the Garden of Eden. And left the Garden of Eden through the gaining of knowledge of good and evil, through gaining the knowledge of ethics, from gaining this understanding. And not only is this exceptionally important or exceptionally interesting as a mythographical reading, it also answers a question which I recently saw on, is it Cosmic Skeptic? Alex O'Connor, I think his name is now. The guy I'm thinking of, at least. There was a short where he basically suggests that the main problem, or one of the problems, is I should have rewatched it before I quote it, but one of the problems is this sort of distinction or the need for a distinction between men and animals. I don't think that's a bigger problem for religion than it is for any philosophy. And this is kind of where this justification can be found. In the fall of man, we get that humans are different from other animals because we are self-aware. And this gives us both the right to, in a limited sense, dictate how the world, or like rule over the world, but it also gives us the sort of, but in that right is the obligation to take care of it, because we understand good and evil. We have this knowledge, we have this ability to comprehend that the consequences of our actions, which other animals don't. And so through the story of the fall of man, we have the understanding that God did not we have the understanding that God is not a creationist. We have the understanding that there are so many signs, so many ways of interpreting the stories of the Bible, that to come to me and insist that you know that what the right interpretation is, while cherry picking wildly and being literal just when it suits you, and by consistently conforming to the preconceived notions that you already have and the prejudices already apparent in our society, by consistently demonstrating this unwillingness to be reasonable, it's clear that creationists are just arrogant psychopaths who want to hide their arrogance behind religion. Want to make it so that I should feel bad for criticizing them for being arrogant assholes, and make it so that actually when I am criticizing them, they can rationalize it as actually I'm criticizing God, I'm against God. And they rationalize that they themselves are on the side of God, when it is eminently clear to anyone who follows the Western tradition of philosophy that they are completely bonkers. And what is what's important to me, as a little bit of a slide in at the end here, because it's annoyed me a lot when I've seen it recently, is this idea that Christianity is the foundation of Western culture, because that's false. The Greeks are the foundation of Western culture. Doubt is the foundation of Western culture. And this creationism and this theocratic leanings, these are antithetical to Western culture. These, in fact, are emblematic of non-Western cultures. There's a reason why atheists think it's hilarious that the far right in the religious right in America and the religious right in Iraq have basically the same repressive social views. Because, because it seems obvious if you don't believe in God, but it seems also clear that uh, that you're not following the Western school of philosophy. You're not following Western culture. You are, in fact, looking at a different culture and saying that is what our culture was all along, when it practically never was. All of our culture is defined not by the church, but by our rejection of it, by our rebellion to it. Protestantism, the dominant religion or the dominant form of Christianity in America, is this rejection of the faith, this rejection of the dogma that pervaded it. And this insistence on creationism is a return to this dogma. It is, in fact, Roman. It is a worship not of the Western culture that grew and flourished into what it is today, that became so powerful in the world, for good and bad. For good and bad, mostly for the world. We did great from it. Lovely. We had a wonderful time. But what this is, this culture that is embodied, this sort of tyrannical view that of a state religion, of enforcing your own certain views. These are all very Roman ideas. These are very sophist ideas, and they are very contrary to the Socratic ideals from which Western culture comes from. This fixation on Christianity is much more Roman than it is Christian. Because Jesus had a great story about this. When Jesus was asked, what makes someone good? Jesus said, once upon a time, there was a man on the road from Nazareth to Jerusalem, from Jericho to Jerusalem, who was beset by bandits. As he lay bleeding, battered, with no clothes on, everything stolen from him, he had no choice but to cry out for help. And as he was lying there on the road, first he was passed by a priest who did not help him. Then he was passed by a Levite. Levites, in case you don't live 2,000 years ago, were holy men. They were born holy. It's kind of an interesting thing if you want to look it up, but these are people who were very well respected, holy characters, men of God, who'd dedicated their life from birth to studying God's word. And the Levite too, did not help the man who was lying on the ground, bleeding to death. Then came the Samaritan. The Samaritans, much like the Levites, I'll explain you, the Samaritans were not holy. They were hated. They were thought to have burned down the second temple. They were blamed collectively as a group, and they were hated. But the Samaritan helped this man, tended to his wounds, cleaned the man, dressed him in fresh clothes, let him rest over the night, and paid for his rest and his food. So Jesus ends the story. Do you see who was good in that story? This being an answer to the question, what makes someone good? Was not being holy, it's not being pious, it's not proclaiming your faith in God, it's not presenting a grand ideal. It was, in fact, doing good unto other people. And that is something that the religious right completely fails to do in every country where it embeds its cancerous growth. To insist that your interpretation of Christianity is the basis for Western culture is false, not only historically and culturally, but theologically. Christ would be ashamed of you. And that is, I think, pretty much all I have to say on the matter. Be critical.